The crystal chandelier above the grand lobby of the Oak and Ivy Country Club caught the afternoon light, fracturing it into 1,000 sharp, blinding prisms across the Italian marble floor. The ambient hum of a string quartet and the delicate clinking of crystal champagne flutes were abruptly shattered by a voice so piercing it could have cut glass. "You look like unwashed charity, Clara. Honestly, it's an absolute insult to the aesthetic of this establishment." Vanessa's voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings, drawing the greedy, staring eyes of the county's self-proclaimed elite. She stood there, a grotesque monument to leveraged debt, clutching a highly recognizable, logo-covered handbag like a shield. Beside her stood Julian, her husband, smirking behind a veneer of fake bravado. But it wasn't Vanessa's screeching that froze the air in my lungs. It was Mark, my husband, the man who had sworn to protect me. He stood just inches away from Vanessa, holding a watered-down scotch. He didn't step in front of me. He didn't raise his voice to defend his wife. Instead, he looked at my simple, unbranded linen dress, his eyes narrowing with profound, unmistakable embarrassment. He subtly shifted his weight, stepping away from me and aligning his shoulder with Vanessa's Porteous. In that single millimeter of movement, a 5-year marriage simply evaporated. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't let my face betray a single micro-expression of the devastation ripping through my chest. I simply reached into the pocket of my dress, pulled out my phone, and tapped out a single, encrypted message to my private wealth manager. "Initiate total asset foreclosure on account 884. Now I hit send. The screen went dark. And with it, their entire fabricated reality. Whispering, intimate tone. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their fake empire, brick by hollow brick, and left them begging in the very lobby they tried to ban me from, I want to know who is listening with me tonight. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are tuning in from. And if you believe that true karma is a dish best served absolutely freezing, hit that like and subscribe button. Let's descend into the shadows together. Normal, calm storytelling tone. To understand the sheer magnitude of the mistake Mark made that Sunday afternoon, we have to rewind to the world, and more importantly to my husband. I am Clara, a quiet, introverted freelance botanical illustrator. I spend my days mixing watercolors, studying the delicate venation of fern leaves, and dressing in understated Porteous, natural fabrics. I drive a reliable, 5-year-old hybrid sedan. I am by all superficial metrics entirely average. What? Mark did not know what I deliberately hid to ensure I was loved for my soul, and not my portfolio was my maiden name. I am the sole living heir and majority shareholder of Vanguard Horizons. We are not new money flashy. We don't buy sports cars in neon colors or cover our bodies in designer logos. My family's trust deals in systemic power. We acquire distressed debt. We maneuver private equity. And we own the commercial real estate that underpins the local economy. In short, I possess the kind of quiet, terrifying wealth that controls the very ground these country club elites walk on. When Mark and I met 5 years ago, it was pure. He was a junior analyst at a mid-tier tech firm, drowning in student loans. But he was kind. He was grounded. He used to bring me cheap bodega coffee while I painted at our tiny, scratched kitchen table, kissing the top of my head and telling me my art was worth more than gold. I loved him with a fierce, protective loyalty. I paid off his student debt quietly through a random lottery grant I fabricated just to see him breathe easier. I wanted us to build a life together, step by honest step. But then, the shift happened. About 8 months ago, Mark received a significant promotion. He was elevated to vice president of regional sales. It came with a handsome 6-figure salary, stock options, and a corporate expense account. In the current economic climate of the United States, where inflation is quietly suffocating the middle class and interest rates are punishing the reckless, Mark's new income was a blessing. It should have been a foundation for absolute security. Instead, it became a poison. The money didn't just change his tax bracket, it mutated his entirely personality. He was suddenly thrust into a circle of executives and local high society figures, and the desperation to belong consumed him like a virus. He became obsessed with optics. He traded his comfortable loafers for stiff, incredibly uncomfortable designer shoes that gave him blisters he tried to hide. He started reading magazines about luxury watches he couldn't afford without financing. And then, he brought Vanessa and Julian into our lives. They were the self-appointed gatekeepers of the local elite. The first time I met them at a dinner party, the scent of Vanessa's heavy, overpowering, mass-market aerosol perfume masquerading as bespoque oud wood nearly gave me a migraine. They spoke exclusively in brands and zip codes. Their clothes were stiff, lacking the effortless drape of true, high-quality textiles. To my trained eye, they were screaming red flags. They were the epitome of the modern illusion, entirely leveraged, living paycheck to paycheck on maxed-out credit lines, projecting a billionaire aesthetic on a subprime budget. But Mark was completely mesmerized. He looked at Julian like a mentor. He began staying out late for networking drinks that drained our joint checking account. And slowly, the man who loved my quiet nature began to resent it. He started making offhand comments about my appearance. "Could you wear something a little more structured, Clara?" "Maybe something with a label," he would ask, adjusting his tie in the mirror, refusing to make eye contact with me. "Vanessa knows a great stylist. You just look a little plain." For the circles were moving in now. The heartbreak was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing bleed. It was sitting in my studio late at night, watching the headlights of his car pull into the driveway at 2:00 am, knowing he was out trying to buy the approval of empty, vapid strangers. I watched the love of my life willingly hollow himself out. I offered to go to couples counseling. I tried to plan quiet weekend getaways to reconnect. He brushed me off, citing critical networking opportunities. He was choosing the illusion over our reality. He was choosing them over me. The grief was suffocating. I spent weeks mourning the death of the man I married while he still slept in the bed beside me. But deep within me, beneath the sorrow of the devoted wife, the dormant instincts of a corporate apex predator began to stir. If he wanted to worship at the altar of wealth and status, he was about to learn a brutal lesson about who actually owned the church. The incident at the Oak and Ivy Country Club didn't break me. It merely gave me the permission I needed to stop crying and start dismantling. The Sunday morning of the Oak and Ivy brunch began with a suffocating, heavy silence in our home. The air felt thick, charged with an anxiety that belonged entirely to Mark. I watched him from the doorway of our bedroom, observing the frantic, desperate energy with which he dressed. He was wrestling with a slim fit, aggressively tailored suit he had put on a high-interest credit card just 2 weeks prior. The fabric was stiff, the lining clearly synthetic, causing a thin sheen of sweat to form on his forehead before we had even left the house. He was terrified of not looking the part. I, on the other hand, chose a simple, flowing midi dress made of raw, undyed Italian linen. It bore no logos, no flashing hardware, no easily identifiable markers of price. To the untrained eye, it was just a plain dress. To those who actually understood textiles, the drape, the stitching, and the sheer quality of the fabric whispered a level of bespoke luxury that retail stores simply do not sell. I paired it with a vintage, unbranded leather clutch that had belonged to my grandmother. As I walked down the stairs, Mark stopped pacing the hallway and stared at me, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered disappointment. "Is that what you're wearing, Clara?" he asked, his voice tight. He adjusted his silk tie, which was tied just a fraction too tightly around his neck. "Vanessa and Julian are hosting a VIP table today. There are going to be major investors there. Real estate developers. People who actually matter in the current market. You couldn't have put on something, I don't know, something with a little more prestige. You look like you're going to a farmer's market." I didn't flinch. I just looked at the man I had spent 5 years loving, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the desperate, hollow ambition radiating from him. "I am dressed perfectly appropriately for a Sunday brunch." "Mark," I replied evenly. He scoffed, grabbing his keys. "Just please, Clara, Try not to embarrass me today. Try to fit the aesthetic for once. Let Vanessa do the talking. The drive to the Oak and Ivy Country Club was a masterclass in silent agony. The club itself was a relic of old-world architecture, nestled deep in the lush, private woodlands of upstate New York. It was a place designed for quiet conversations and multi-generational wealth. But lately, as the U.S. economy shifted and the desperate scramble for social media status peaked, the club had been infiltrated by people who mistook loud price tags for actual value. We walked into the grand dining room, a cavernous space bathed in natural sunlight and the scent of fresh orchids, and there, holding court at a center table, were Vanessa and Julian. They were a sensory assault. Vanessa was draped in an aggressively bright, heavily branded dress that screamed its designer's name from 50 feet away. Her wrists were stacked with clunky, gold-plated bracelets that clanged loudly against the table every time she moved. Julian sat beside her, wearing a velvet blazer that was entirely too heavy for the season, aggressively adjusting his cuff to show off a massive, diamond-encrusted watch. As we approached the table, my eyes immediately locked onto Julian's wrist. The second hand on his luxury watch was ticking. Tick-tick. Tick. A true, high-end automatic timepiece sweeps silently. It does not tick. It was a cheap, Canal Street replica. And Vanessa's handbag, resting proudly on the table, the stitching on the handle was completely uneven. They were drowning in a sea of counterfeit armor, desperately trying to project a billionaire lifestyle while the current U.S. inflation rates were likely eating them alive. "Mark, darling," Vanessa shrieked, her voice cutting through the refined murmur of the dining room like a siren. She stood up, completely ignoring me, and kissed Mark on both cheeks. "We were starting to think you weren't going to make it." Julian was just telling the table about his new venture capital fund. Julian leaned back, flashing a blindingly white, veneered smile. "Yeah, leveraging some subprime commercial assets. You know how it is in this economy. Cash is trash. Debt is wealth. You just have to know how to play the algorithm." I sat down quietly, smoothing my linen dress. It took every ounce of my self-control not to laugh. Debt is wealth. Only a man mere inches from total financial ruin would spout such absolute nonsense in a room full of actual money. He was playing a dangerous, idiotic game of financial roulette. For the first 45 minutes, I was treated like a ghost. I sipped my sparkling water, listening as Mark enthusiastically nodded along to Julian's catastrophic financial advice. But Vanessa, fueled by 3 mimosas and a deep-seated, insecure need to assert dominance, eventually turned her crosshairs on me. She leaned across the table, her eyes raking over my outfit with theatrical disgust. "So Clara," she drawled, making sure her voice was loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Mark tells me you draw plants for a living." She let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "That is so quaint. Honestly, in this economy, I don't know how Mark carries the financial burden of a wife who treats life like a hobby." The table went dead silent. The neighboring guests stopped their conversations, turning their heads to watch the spectacle. I set my water glass down. Slowly, deliberately, I looked Vanessa dead in the eyes. My expression a mask of absolute, chilling calm. "I am perfectly financially independent, Vanessa. But thank you for your sudden concern regarding our household income." Vanessa's face flushed red under her heavy makeup. She hated my calm. She needed me to break, to cry, to prove I was beneath her. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping violently against the marble floor. "Oh, please, you're a charity case, Clara," she yelled, completely abandoning any pretense of country club etiquette. "Look at you. You look like unwashed charity. You walk into a VIP establishment looking like a peasant, dragging down your husband's brand. You are a low-value liability to his career. Honestly, it's an absolute insult to the aesthetic of this club to even have you sitting here." The entire dining room was now watching. The air was electrified with secondhand embarrassment and shock. I slowly turned my head to look at Mark. My husband. The man I had sworn to honor and protect. This was his moment. This was the moment he was supposed to stand up, throw his napkin on the table, and defend the woman he loved. I looked into his eyes, giving him one final, desperate chance to save his own soul. Mark looked at me. Then, he looked around the room at the wealthy patrons staring at us. He looked at Julian, who was raising an eyebrow. And finally, he looked at Vanessa. He swallowed hard, his face pale. And then, he leaned away from me. "Vanessa is right," Mark muttered, his voice shaking, but loud enough for everyone to hear. He wouldn't even look me in the eye. He stared at his water glass. You shouldn't have come dressed like that. Clara, you're embarrassing me. Maybe you should just go wait in the car. I need to finish this meeting." The absolute silence that followed was deafening. The final tether, the very last thread of love, respect, and mercy I held for the man sitting next to me, snapped. It didn't break with a tear. It broke with a profound, terrifying clarity. He didn't just fail to protect me. He offered me up as a sacrifice to protect his fake, pathetic illusion of status. I didn't cry. My heart didn't shatter. It turned to absolute ice. I stood up from the table. My movements were graceful, unhurried, and dripping with an unspoken, terrifying authority. I didn't look at Vanessa. I didn't look at Julian. I looked down at Mark, seeing him not as my husband, but as a liability that needed to be liquidated. "I won't be waiting in the car." "Mark," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the silent room like a gunshot. "Enjoy your brunch." I turned and walked away. The sound of my leather heels clicking against the marble floor was the only sound in the room. As I crossed the grand lobby, pulling my phone from my pocket to send that single, destructive message to my wealth manager, the heartbroken wife officially died. The billionaire woke up, and she was starving for absolute ruin. The sunlight hitting the windshield of my 5-year-old hybrid sedan felt entirely different as I slid behind the steering wheel. Just an hour ago, this car was a symbol of my humility, a conscious choice to live a grounded life. Now, as the heavy door clicked shut, sealing me inside a soundproof bubble away from the toxic country club air, the car became my war room. I didn't turn the key in the ignition. I sat in the absolute, pristine silence of the parking lot. My hands weren't shaking. My breathing was slow, rhythmic, and terrifyingly steady. The woman who painted ferns and baked sourdough bread on Sunday mornings was gone, cleanly excised from my soul the moment Mark told me to wait in the car. What remained was the apex predator my grandfather had raised me to be, the silent architect of Vanguard Horizons. I reached into the hidden compartment beneath the center console and pulled out a secondary phone, a sleek, encrypted satellite device with no branding. I pressed a single, biometric key. The line didn't even ring. It was answered instantly. "Madam Chairman." A crisp, British voice spoke. It was Elias Thorne, the head of global intelligence and asset management for my family's private estate. For 5 years, he had respected my boundaries, managing my billions from the shadows while I played the role of a middle-class wife. "Elias," I said, my voice dropping into a cold, metallic register I hadn't used in half a decade. "The sabbatical is over. I need a level 1 forensic financial sweep." "Understood. Targets." Elias didn't ask questions. He only executed. Julian and Vanessa Sterling. And Mark Vance. Saying my husband's name in the same breath as those parasites left a bitter taste in my mouth, but I swallowed it down. "I want everything. Elias. I want their tax returns, their hidden offshore routing numbers, their credit utilization ratios, their search histories. I want to know what they had for breakfast and exactly how much they owe for the plate they ate it on. I need the raw data in 2 hours. Consider it done." "Clara, shall I prepare the legal division?" "Put them on standby," I whispered. A dark, dangerous smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. "I'm not going to sue them, Elias. I'm going to erase them." I drove back to the house Mark and I shared. Walking through the front door, the space felt alien. I looked at the aggressively modern, uncomfortable leather sofa Mark had recently financed because Vanessa said it looked European. I looked at the cheap, mass-market art he had hung over my original watercolor paintings, because my work didn't fit his new executive aesthetic. He had turned our sanctuary into a cheap movie set. I didn't pack a suitcase. I didn't smash his carefully arranged collection of entry-level luxury watches. I simply went into my studio, packed my grandmother's vintage jewelry, my favorite brushes, and my encrypted laptop into a single leather tote. I made a cup of Earl Grey tea, sat at our scratched kitchen table, and waited for the ghost to be dragged into the light. Exactly 1 hour and 54 minutes later, my encrypted tablet chimed. A heavily redacted, 300-page dossier materialized on the screen. I took a sip of my tea and began to read. What I found wasn't just a confirmation of my suspicions. It was a masterpiece of pathetic, desperate fraud, heavily fueled by the current economic climate in the United States. Let's start with the gatekeepers of the elite, Vanessa and Julian. The reality of their finances was breathtakingly catastrophic. Julian didn't own a venture capital fund. He was a glorified middleman, operating a hollow LLC out of a shared workspace. In an era of punishingly high U.S. interest rates and tech sector volatility, Julian had tried to play the big leagues by taking out massive, adjustable-rate loans to invest in subprime commercial real estate. When the market shifted, he was caught holding the bag. Their net worth wasn't in the millions. It was actively negative $4.2 million. Their sprawling mansion, foreclosure proceedings had quietly begun 3 months ago. The sports cars leased, and currently 90 days past due on payments. Vanessa's designer wardrobe and those heavy silver, clanking bracelets, financed entirely through a terrifying web of 24 high-yield credit cards, strategically balance transferred every month to avoid defaulting. They were drowning in a liquidity crisis of their own making, terrified that the high society world they desperately clung to would smell the blood in the water. But it was Mark's file that made the tea in my stomach turn to ice. I scrolled past his personal checking accounts, straight to the corporate data. Elias had effortlessly bypassed Mark's sudden influx of cash. The expensive dinners, the tailored suits. It wasn't just from his new VP salary. Mark was actively embezzling from his mid-tier tech firm. He was incredibly sloppy about it, too. He was approving inflated vendor invoices to a phantom consulting firm registered in Delaware, a firm that, according to Elias's trace, routed the money directly into a hidden checking account under Mark's name. He was stealing corporate funds to buy the approval of a couple who couldn't even afford their own electricity bill. But the ultimate betrayal, in the knife that twisted so deeply, it severed whatever microscopic shred of mercy I had left, was buried in his credit card statements. There were recurring charges, $400 a night at the Grand Marquis Hotel downtown, always on a Tuesday afternoon, always billed as a client lunch meeting on his calendar. Elias had pulled the security footage from the hotel lobby. I clicked the video file. The grainy footage showed Mark walking into the elevator. A moment later, a woman walked in behind him, wearing an aggressively loud designer trench coat, her arm instantly wrapping around his waist. It was Vanessa. While Julian was out frantically trying to patch the sinking ship of his fake empire, Vanessa was sleeping with my husband in cheap hotel rooms paid for by stolen corporate money. Mark wasn't just blindly following them. He was actively funding his own mistress's lifestyle. While she publicly humiliated his wife, I closed the laptop. The silence in the house was absolute. A lesser woman would have screamed. A weaker woman would have printed the photos, thrown them in Mark's face when he got home, and demanded a divorce. But I wasn't just a scorned wife. I was the majority shareholder of Vanguard Horizons. I didn't deal in domestic disputes. I dealt in hostile takeovers. They had handed me the exact blueprints to their destruction. Julian's debt was easily purchasable. Mark's embezzlement was a federal crime waiting to be reported. And Vanessa's pride was a brittle, hollow shell, resting on stolen money. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Elias one more time. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the kitchen floor. "Elias," I whispered, the tone of my voice practically vibrating with cold anticipation. "I need you to contact the commercial banking division. Find out who holds the paper on Julian Sterling's adjustable-rate mortgages and his auto leases. And when I find them," Elias asked, "buy the debt. All of it. Pay a premium if you have to. By tomorrow morning. I want Vanguard Horizons to be the sole owner of their miserable Fiamerler. Pathetic lives. I paused, looking at the fake, ticking replica watch Mark had left on the kitchen counter, and Elias draft an anonymous, airtight whistleblower packet to the compliance board of Mark's tech firm. Include all the wire transfers. It will be a bloodbath. Clara. Elias noted, a hint of professional respect in his voice. Good, I replied softly. Let them bleed. I left the house on Sunday evening before Mark returned from his little networking brunch. I didn't leave a dramatic letter. I didn't pack boxes or smash a single plate in the kitchen. I simply took off my wedding band, a modest, 2-carat diamond that Mark had spent years loudly bragging about to anyone who would listen, and placed it perfectly dead center on his cheap, financed, faux leather sofa. The absolute, deafening silence of that empty house was the loudest statement I could possibly make. I checked into a penthouse suite at the St. Regis, a property that, unbeknownst to the general public, was secretly managed under a Vanguard Horizons subsidiary trust. The contrast from Mark's house to my new environment was immediate and breathtaking. Here there were no aggressive, flashy brand logos or cheap, failing veneers. There was only the silent, heavy drape of custom silk curtains, the faint scent of fresh white tea, and the absolute, terrifying peace of ultimate control. Monday morning, 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The U.S. financial markets opened. The execution began. In the high-stakes world of commercial private equity, debt is not just a number on a glowing screen, it is a leash. And by 9:30 Vanguard Horizons held the leash to Julian and Vanessa's entire fabricated existence. Elias had moved with the lethal, invisible efficiency of a ghost, quietly purchasing every single one of Julian's subprime commercial loans and Vanessa's aggressively leveraged credit portfolios from their respective panicked lenders. We bought their debt for pennies on the dollar. The tragic beauty of poorly structured, high-yield debt in a volatile economy is buried in the fine print. Julian had desperately signed contracts filled with material adverse change clauses to secure his funding. As the new sole creditor, I had the legal right to demand an immediate, full capital liquidity review. When Julian naturally failed to produce the required millions because he didn't actually have a dime to his name, it triggered an automatic, catastrophic default. I didn't call them to announce it. I let the financial system do the talking. At 1:15 p.m., Vanessa was hosting a highly visible women in business luncheon at a Michelin-starred restaurant downtown. Likely planning to charge it to a credit card she intended to balance transfer the following week. Elias forwarded me the real-time ping from our payment processing division. He sat on mi little chais alone, sipping a cup of perfectly steeped gyokuro green tea, and watched the digital dashboard light up. Transaction attempt. Email subaiwusher. Null known status. Declined. Reason. Account frozen by creditor. I could perfectly envision the scene, the polite but firm waiter holding the little black leather booklet, Vanessa, her heavy, fake gold bracelets clanking as she laughed off the embarrassing bank error to her guests, confidently handing over a second platinum card. Transaction attempt. Email subaiwusher. Null. Status. Declined. Reason. Account seized. Then a third card. Then a fourth. Until she was sitting there, her face burning a deep, humiliating crimson beneath her heavy contouring makeup, completely out of options, forced to visibly beg one of her inferior friends to cover the bill. The public humiliation would have been an exquisite appetizer, but the main course was served at 3:00 a.m. on Tuesday. Julian and Vanessa were fast asleep in their heavily mortgaged, soon-to-be foreclosed mansion. They awoke to the heavy, grinding sound of diesel engines idling in their circular driveway. I had authorized the immediate enforcement of the repossession clauses on their luxury vehicles. Elias sent me the secure dashcam footage from the recovery team. It was a cinematic masterpiece of pathetic reality. Julian sprinted out the front door in a silk robe, screaming violently at the tow truck drivers who were expertly hoisting his leased Porsche 911 and Vanessa's customized Range Rover onto the steel flatbeds. Do you have any idea who I am? Julian shrieked, his voice cracking hysterically in the cool night air, completely shattering his cool guy facade. I will sue you into the ground. Put the cars down right now. The lead driver, a massive man entirely unbothered by fake wealth, simply handed Julian a thick, sealed legal envelope bearing the intimidating, embossed watermark of Vanguard Horizons. Take it up with the lien holder. Buddy, you're 90 days delinquent. The cars belong to Vanguard now. Julian stood barefoot on the cold asphalt, clutching the envelope, watching his entire billionaire aesthetic being towed away into the darkness. He was a man who had suddenly realized he was standing on a trap door, and the lever had just been pulled. While Julian and Vanessa were bleeding out in the dark, Tuesday morning brought the slaughter directly to Mark's doorstep. Mark strutted into his tech firm's headquarters at 8:45 a.m., likely still smelling of Vanessa's cheap aerosol perfume from their hotel rendezvous, fully expecting to be praised by upper management. Instead, when he confidently swiped his keycard at the exclusive executive elevator, the scanner flashed an angry, Sulil red, access denied. A security guard politely intercepted him. He wasn't escorted up to his corner office, but down to a sterilely, fluorescent-lit, windowless conference room on the ground floor. Waiting for him were the head of human resources and two incredibly severe-looking men from internal corporate compliance. Sitting perfectly centered on the table was the anonymous, airtight whistleblower packet Elias had flawlessly compiled. I received the play-by-play update from a planted associate within the firm. The execution was surgical. They didn't give Mark a chance to use his salesman charm. They opened the folder and presented the exact offshore routing numbers, the timestamps, the fake vendor invoices, and the IP logs that traced the embezzlement directly back to his personal laptop. And then, the final nail in the coffin, they presented the hotel receipts from his Tuesday afternoons with Vanessa, heavily highlighting that he had paid for his vile infidelity using stolen corporate capital. Mark, the compliance officer, said, his voice entirely devoid of human emotion. Effective immediately. Your employment is indefinitely suspended, pending a federal investigation. Your corporate accounts are frozen. Your stock options are voided under the gross misconduct clause. Please slide your company phone, your laptop, and your wallet across the table. We need the corporate card back. Now, in less than 20 minutes. Mark Vance went from a rising, arrogant vice president to an unemployed, disgraced suspect facing massive federal embezzlement charges. He was escorted out of the building through the front lobby, carrying his personal belongings in a pathetic little cardboard box, in full view of the junior analysts he had spent months belittling and talking down to. By Wednesday evening, the entire toxic social ecosystem they had built was collapsing in on itself like a dying star. They were entirely cut off from their money, their credit, and their status. The invisible noose I had woven from their own greed was now pulled brutally tight, choking the life out of their fake, glamorous empire. And the most beautiful, satisfying part of it all. As they scrambled, panicked, and began to turn on each other in the dark, they had absolutely no idea that the hand pulling the rope belonged to the quiet, unassuming woman they had publicly humiliated on Sunday afternoon. They thought they were just the unlucky victims of a sudden, cruel economic downturn. They didn't know I was the economy, and I was only just getting started. The most exquisite, terrifying thing about destroying someone financially is that you rarely have to lift a finger to break their spirit. When you strip away the buffer of designer clothes, the heavy curtain of expensive dinners, and the loud, distracting hum of luxury cars, people are forced to sit in the deafening silence of who they truly are. And for people like Vanessa, Julian, and Mark, who they truly were was entirely hollow. From the pristine, soundproof sanctuary of my penthouse suite, I watched the psychological warfare unfold. It was a masterpiece of paranoia, and they were directing it themselves. The first structure to completely collapse was the sterling marriage. Without the glue of stolen credit and the desperate, shared delusion of high society, Vanessa and Julian's mansion became a war zone. I didn't need to bug their home. The information flowed freely to me through Maria, their unpaid, exhausted head housekeeper. The moment Vanguard Horizons froze their accounts, I quietly placed Maria on my personal payroll, ensuring she was handsomely compensated to simply keep her eyes open and her mouth shut while she packed her bags to leave them. According to Maria, the screaming matches began on Wednesday morning and didn't stop for 48 hours. The sprawling, heavily mortgaged estate, once a fake temple to their vanity, became a prison. The electricity remained on, but the illusion was dead. Julien is fragile. Inflated ego completely shattered by the repossession of his vehicles and the collapse of his fraudulent venture capital firm. Resorted to pacing the empty marble hallways in yesterday's clothes, violently blaming Vanessa for bleeding him dry. You and your pathetic obsession with the aesthetic, Julien had screamed, his voice cracking, echoing through the empty foyer, as Maria quietly folded linens upstairs. You spent $200,000 on fake handbags and aesthetic dermatology we didn't have. You bankrupted us for Instagram. Vanessa, cornered and stripped of her platinum cards, turned completely feral. The polished, sneering woman from the country club was gone. She threw a heavy crystal vase at Julian's head, shattering it against the imported wallpaper. You promised me an empire. You pathetic fraud. Shashrika back, her voice raw and hysterical. You're a failure. You're nothing but a middle-class imposter who doesn't know how to play the game. They were two rats trapped on a rapidly sinking ship, violently tearing into each other for a piece of driftwood that didn't exist. But the most poetic justice of the week was reserved for Mark, suspended, disgraced, and facing the absolute terror of a federal embezzlement indictment. Mark desperately sought refuge. On Thursday night, entirely oblivious to the fact that Vanessa's empire had also burned to the ground, he took a cheap, shared rideshare to the Sterling estate, likely seeking comfort in the arms of his mistress. He needed Vanessa to tell him he was still powerful, still a high-value executive, still part of the elite. Elias's surveillance team captured the security footage from the Sterling's front gate. It was a tragicomedy. Mark rang the buzzer, looking disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from days of sleeping on a cheap motel mattress. Vanessa answered the intercom. She didn't invite him in. She didn't offer him comfort. When Mark frantically explained that he had lost his job and needed a place to lay low because federal compliance officers were auditing his accounts, Vanessa's reaction was absolute. Chilling ice. You're a broke, unemployed criminal. Vanessa's voice spat through the grainy intercom speaker, dripping with absolute disgust. You are a total liability. If you ever come near this property again, I'm calling the police and telling them you're harassing me. We are done. The intercom clicked off. Mark stood alone in the dark on the cold pavement, watching the wrought iron gates remain firmly closed. The woman he had destroyed his marriage for, the woman he had stolen corporate funds to impress, discarded him the absolute second his bank account hit zero. It took exactly 12 hours for the sheer, suffocating panic to drive Mark back to the one person he thought he could always manipulate. Me. My burner phone began lighting up on Friday morning. Dozens of missed calls. Frantic, breathless text messages. Clara. Please. I made a mistake. I love you. Please call me back. I'm in so much trouble. I let him sweat for an entire day. I let the silence stretch out, letting his imagination conjure up the worst possible scenarios. Finally, on Saturday afternoon, I sent him a single text. Meet me at the diner on 4th Street. 8:00 p.m. I chose a cheap, sticky table diner, completely outside of the upscale zip codes he so desperately craved. I dressed in a soft, oversized cashmere sweater and wore absolutely no makeup. I wanted to look exactly like the gentle, naive artist he thought he had married. When Mark walked through the diner doors, the bell jingled loudly. He looked like a walking corpse. His skin was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was sweating through a cheap, polyblend dress shirt. The arrogant VP from the country club was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. He slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from me, his hands shaking as he reached across the table to grab mine. I let him hold my hand. It was cold, limp, and entirely unresponsive. Clara, he choked out, his eyes filling with desperate, pathetic tears. Clara, thank God. I am so sorry about the club. It was the stress. She was manipulating me. She got in my head. But it's you. It's always been you. I tilted my head, widening my eyes, playing the perfect role of the confused, heartbroken wife. Mark, what is going on? Why did you leave the house? The bank called. They said your accounts are frozen. He swallowed hard, looking around the diner as if the feds were hiding in the kitchen. It's a misunderstanding at work. A huge, clerical error. But they're suspending me without pay. Clara. And they're threatening legal action. It's a witch hunt. He reached into his worn briefcase and pulled out a stack of hastily printed documents. He pushed them across the sticky table toward me. I need your help. Clara. You're the only one I trust, he whispered, his voice trembling with manufactured sweetness. I need to hire a defense attorney. A really good one. To clear my name. But my assets are frozen. I brought the paperwork for a home equity line of credit. If we just borrow against our house, your name is on the deed too. We can pull out enough cash to save me from going to prison. It's just temporary. Honey, I swear. I looked down at the paperwork. He wanted to drain the equity of the modest home we shared. The home I had quietly paid off years ago, through a shell LLC, to defend himself against crimes he absolutely committed to fund his affair. The audacity was breathtaking. I looked back up at him. I let my eyes well up with a tiny, perfectly executed layer of moisture. Oh, Mark, I whispered softly, my voice trembling with feigned innocence. I can't. What do you mean you can't? The sweetness vanished from his tone for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of panicked aggression. Before he forced the mask back on, Clara, please. It just requires your signature. It's our house. I spoke to a lawyer friend yesterday. I lied smoothly, staring deeply into his terrified eyes. Because I was so worried about you. And well, apparently, the deed to the house is tied up in some strange probate trust from my grandfather. The lawyer said it's incredibly complicated and legally locked. I can't authorize a loan against it. Mark, even if I wanted to, the bank would reject it instantly. Mark stared at me, the color entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost, haunting his own life. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. There was no equity. There was no bailout. There was no safety net. Locked, he whispered, his voice completely hollow. I'm so sorry. Mark, I said, sliding my hands out from under his. Standing up from the sticky booth, I looked down at him, savoring the absolute, crushing despair radiating from his body. I guess you'll just have to rely on your own aesthetic now. I walked out of the diner, leaving him sitting alone with his useless paperwork. The trap was sprung. The rats were turning on each other. The poison was in their veins, and the only thing left was for them to bleed out under the bright, unforgiving lights of the ultimate stage. There is a profound, almost clinical fascination in watching a drowning person violently thrash against the water, completely unaware that the heavy weights pulling them under are tied around their own ankles. Desperation is a powerful, intoxicating drug. And for Vanessa, Julian, and Mark, the withdrawal symptoms were pushing them toward absolute insanity. By the following week, the reality of their situation should have forced them into hiding, but narcissism, especially the kind bred in the echo chambers of fake high society, does not allow for retreat. It demands an audience. On Wednesday afternoon, my encrypted tablet chimed with a high-priority alert from the commercial leasing division of Vanguard Horizons. It was Elias. Madam Chairman. Elias's voice was smooth, but laced with a rare hint of dark amusement. You are not going to believe the audacity of the Sterling family. Surprise me. Elias, I murmured, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, looking down at the crawling traffic of the city. Julian and Vanessa have just booked the grand ballroom at the Oak and Ivy Country Club for this Saturday night. They are hosting a philanthropic investor gala. It appears Julian is attempting one final, desperate Hail Mary to attract a new angel investor to bail out his collapsed shell company. He's trying to sell the illusion of success to secure blind capital. And how exactly are they paying the venue deposit? I asked, knowing their accounts were frozen solid. Julian attempted to wire the $50,000 deposit using a severely kited business account from a secondary, unsecured regional bank. It's entirely fraudulent. The bank's automated fraud detection flagged it immediately. The Oak and Ivy's financial director is holding the transfer, waiting for authorization from the property's holding company to reject it and alert the authorities. The holding company, of course, was Vanguard Horizons. It was me. I held their final, pathetic lifeline in the palm of my hand. I could have rejected the wire, watched them get arrested for wire fraud on a Wednesday afternoon, and ended the game quietly. But a quiet ending does not serve karma. Karma requires a stage. Karma requires an audience. Push the authorization through. Elias, I commanded, my voice dropping into a chilling, absolute whisper. Approve the fraudulent wire. Let them have the ballroom. Let them buy the cheap champagne and the wilting centerpieces. Let them invite every single arrogant, hollow socialite in the county. I want them to build their own gallows. Understood, Elias replied. And what about your husband? Elias had intercepted Mark's emails. Despite Vanessa violently banishing him from her estate, Mark had maxed out a predatory, high-interest payday loan just to purchase a ticket to Vanessa's gala under a fake corporate alias. Mark's delusion was terminal. He genuinely believed that if he could just put on his suit, walk into that country club, and schmooze with the elite, he could find a private billionaire to grant him an undocumented loan to pay back the tech firm before the federal prosecutors filed formal charges. He was a dead man, walking into a graveyard, looking for a doctor. Mark will be there, I said softly. Let the rats gather. Saturday evening arrived with a biting, crisp chill. For 5 years, I had prepared for dates with Mark by wearing soft, unpretentious dresses, applying minimal makeup, and shrinking myself to make his fragile ego feel enormous. I had played the role of the sweet, unremarkable wife flawlessly. That woman was dead. It was time to introduce them to the heir of Vanguard Horizons. I did not go to a boutique. I took a private, heavily armored town car to the underground. Climate-controlled vault attached to our family's estate trust. The wardrobe inside was not fashion. It was armor. I selected a floor-length, midnight blue gown made of heavy double-faced silk crepe. It was custom-draped by a master artisan in Milan, requiring absolutely zero branding to declare its worth. The fabric moved like liquid mercury, structurally flawless, designed to command the gravity of any room it entered. But the masterpiece was the jewelry. I bypassed the trendy, loud designer pieces and unlocked a velvet box that hadn't seen the light of day since my grandmother wore it to a presidential inauguration. It was a single, flawless, unheated Burmese sapphire pendant, surrounded by a halo of impossibly clear, emerald-cut diamonds, resting on a platinum chain. It didn't sparkle aggressively. It glowed with the quiet, terrifying density of generational power. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe style. My makeup was sharp, cold, and predatory. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see Clara the botanical illustrator. I saw the executioner. At 9:00 p.m., my chauffeured Maybach glided up the winding, private driveway of the Oak and Ivy Country Club. The valet rushed forward, his eyes widening slightly at the sheer, customized length of the vehicle. I stepped out into the night air, the heavy silk of my gown brushing against the pavement. The atmosphere inside the club was a masterclass in suffocating tension. From the top of the grand marble staircase, I looked down into the ballroom. It was a pathetic, transparent facade. To the untrained eye, it looked like a luxury event. But to me, the cracks were gaping. The floral arrangements were sparse, padded with cheap greenery. The waitstaff were pouring mid-tier, mass-market sparkling wine into crystal flutes to disguise the label. The entire room smelled of anxiety, heavy perfume, and impending ruin. Exacerbated by the tight credit markets of the current U.S. economy, there, holding court near the ice sculpture, were Vanessa and Julian. Vanessa was wearing a heavily sequined dress that looked rented, her smile tight and manic, as she aggressively pitched Julian's non-existent hedge fund to an elderly real estate developer. Julian was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a napkin, his eyes darting toward the exits every time a waiter dropped a glass. And in the corner, hovering near the open bar, was Mark. He looked absolutely atrocious. His suit was wrinkled, his posture was hunched, and he was desperately trying to corner a group of regional bank managers who were actively trying to step away from him. He kept glancing at Vanessa, like a lost, pathetic dog waiting for a scrap of attention she would never give him. They were all there. The husband who betrayed me, the woman who humiliated me, the man who insulted me. They were swimming in a pool of their own toxic, fraudulent waste, desperately trying to keep their heads above water. I didn't rush. I didn't announce myself. I simply placed one stiletto heel on the marble staircase and began my descent. With every step I took, the ambient noise of the ballroom began to die. The sharp click of my heels against the stone cut through the fake chime. Desperate laughter. Heads began to turn. Conversations snapped shut. The sheer, magnetic force of true, unbothered wealth has a gravitational pull. People part for it instinctively. As I reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped onto the ballroom floor, the crowd physically separated, creating a wide, silent path directly through the center of the room. I walked through the sea of staring faces, my expression completely blank, my posture radiating an absolute, chilling authority. I wasn't there to mingle. I wasn't there to network. I locked eyes with Vanessa across the room. Her manic smile instantly collapsed. The blood drained from her heavily contoured face. Beside her, Julian stopped speaking mid-sentence, his jaw going slack, and from the corner of my eye, I saw Mark drop his champagne glass. It shattered against the floor, a sharp, violent crack that echoed through the dead silent ballroom. The aesthetic had arrived, and it was here to collect its debt. The silence in the grand ballroom of the Oak and Ivy Country Club was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a physical, suffocating weight, pressing down on the room. The string quartet had abruptly stopped playing, their bows hovering awkwardly over their cellos. The clinking of thick, rented champagne flutes ceased entirely. Over 300 pairs of eyes were locked onto me as I glided across the marble floor, the heavy, double-faced silk of my midnight blue gown parting the crowd like Moses at the Red Sea. Vanessa was the first to physically react. The sheer cognitive dissonance of seeing the woman she had publicly branded as unwashed charity, now dripping in generational Delalavdottam and untouchable wealth, caused her brain to effectively short-circuit, her heavily contoured face contorted into an ugly, panicked sneer. She frantically looked around at the staring elite, desperately trying to salvage the fragile, rotting illusion of her gala. "Security," Vanessa screeched, her voice cracking, sounding entirely unhinged and thoroughly out of place in the refined architecture of the room. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her fake gold bracelets clanking frantically. "Someone get the general manager. Right now. How did this trash get past the front gates? She is a trespasser. Remove her from my event." Julian stepped forward, puffing out his chest in his tragically ill-fitting velvet blazer, trying to project the authority of a billionaire he so desperately pretended to be. "You have exactly 5 seconds to turn around and walk out of here, Clara, before I have you arrested. You are humiliating yourself." And then, emerging from the crowd like a pathetic, drowned rat, came Mark, my soon-to-be ex-husband. He pushed his way to Vanessa's side, instantly aligning himself with the sinking ship. One final, fatal time. He looked at me, completely failing to recognize the powerful, terrifying woman standing before him. He only saw the wife he thought he could control. "Clara, have you lost your mind?" Mark hissed, his face pale with panic. "You are ruining everything. You need to leave. You don't belong here. You don't fit the aesthetic." Security. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood there, an immovable pillar of absolute, chilling ice, letting them scream themselves hoarse. The heavy, polished oak doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly swung open, Mr. Sterling, the impeccably dressed general manager of the Oak and Ivy Country Club, sprinted into the room. Behind him were not just the club's private security team, but 4 uniformed local police officers and 2 men in severe, dark suits bearing federal badges. Vanessa's face lit up with absolute, venomous triumph. "Finally, Mr. Sterling," she yelled, pointing at me with a manic, desperate energy. "Arrest her. Throw this uncultured peasant out on the street where she belongs." Mr. Sterling did not look at Vanessa. He did not look at Julian, nor did he look at Mark. He marched directly past them, his perfectly shined shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me, entirely ignoring the chaotic screaming of my antagonists. To the absolute horror of the entire ballroom, the general manager clasped his hands in front of him and bowed deeply, respectfully at the waist. "Madam Chairman," Mr. Sterling said, his voice ringing out clearly in the dead silent room, "we apologize for the disturbance. Your estate instructed us to allow the fraudulent wire transfer to process so this event could commence, as per your strict orders. The authorities are on standby. How would you like to proceed?" The words "Madam Chairman" hit the trio like a physical shockwave. Vanessa's jaw went completely slack. The manic energy drained from her body, replaced by a sudden, violent trembling. Julian stumbled backward, physically bumping into the ice sculpture, his eyes darting frantically between me and the police officers. "See, Chairman," Mark stammered, his voice reduced to a pathetic, breathy squeak. He looked at the flawless Burmese sapphire resting on my collarbone, the multi-million-dollar heirloom he had been too blind to ever notice in our own home. "Clara, what is he talking about?" I finally smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an apex predator looking at its trapped time-slashen, exhausted prey. "I told you, Vanessa, that I was perfectly financially independent," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Yet it carried the terrifying weight of absolute authority. What I didn't mention was that Vanguard Horizons, the private equity firm that just bought every single one of your subprime mortgages, the firm that repossessed your leased cars, and the firm that owns the very ground this country club is built on, belongs entirely to me. Vanessa gasped, clutching her chest, physically unable to draw oxygen into her lungs. The realization that she had been brutally bullying her own executioner shattered her completely. I turned my cold gaze to Julian, who was currently sweating through his cheap velvet blazer. "Your venture capital firm is a hollow LLC. Julian, you are negative $4 million in debt. And worst of all, you attempted to secure this ballroom today using a heavily kited, fraudulent bank wire. That is a federal crime." I reached out my hand. Mr. Sterling immediately placed a thick, black leather folder into my palm. I tossed it onto the floor at Julian and Vanessa's feet. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Those are your permanent, lifetime banishment orders from every property my family owns," I stated coldly. "Including this club. The police waiting by the doors have the warrants for your arrest regarding the wire fraud. Your aesthetic is officially bankrupt." Vanessa collapsed to her knees. She didn't faint. Her legs simply gave out under the crushing public humiliation. She began to sob loud, ugly, desperate wails, burying her face in her hands right there on the marble floor. Julian just stared blankly at the ceiling, his entire fabricated life completely vaporized in less than 60 seconds. Finally, I turned to Mark. He was shaking so violently I could hear his teeth chattering. The arrogant vice president was entirely gone. He fell to his knees beside Vanessa, not to comfort her, but to beg me. He reached out to grab the hem of my silk gown, tears streaming down his face. "Clara, baby, please," he sobbed, his voice raw with pure terror. "I'm your husband. I love you. I didn't know. If I had known who you really were, I never would have." "You never would have stolen from your own company to fund hotel rooms with her," I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave, slicing through his pathetic excuses like a scalpel. I looked down at him with nothing but pure, unadulterated disgust. "You didn't fail me because you didn't know my bank balance. Mark, you failed me because you are fundamentally hollow. You traded a woman who loved you for an empty, rotting illusion. I signaled to the federal agents standing near the entrance. The compliance board at your tech firm was very grateful for my anonymous tip. Mark, I believe those gentlemen in the suits are here to discuss your corporate embezzlement. Mark let out a guttural, animalistic cry of despair. He tried to crawl toward me. But Mr. Sterling snapped his fingers. The security team and law enforcement moved in flawlessly. They grabbed Julian by the arms, dragging him to his feet. They hauled a screaming, thrashing Vanessa off the floor, her heavy makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. And they hauled Mark up by the collar of his cheap suit, slapping cold steel handcuffs onto his wrists in front of 300 horrified, whispering socialites. I stood perfectly still, watching as the three of them were aggressively marched out the heavy double doors, their screams fading into the cool night air. They were stripped of their wealth, their freedom, and their precious status. They were left with absolutely nothing but the agonizing realization that they had engineered their own total destruction. Mr. Sterling turned to me, bowing once more. "Shall we clear the room, Madam Chairman?" "No," I replied softly, picking up a crystal flute of genuine vintage champagne from a passing waiter's tray. "Let them stay. After all, I own the place. I think I'll enjoy the music for a while." I took a slow, victorious sip, the chill of the champagne perfectly matching the ice in my veins. The wife they tried to bury was dead, but the billionaire they awakened was going to live forever. Whispering, intimate tone. And that, my friends, is how you successfully liquidate toxic assets from your life. They wanted to play a game of aesthetics and power, completely unaware that I wrote the rulebook. I want to hear from every single one of you down in the comments. What was the most satisfying part of their downfall? Let me know. And if you crave more stories where karma doesn't just knock, but kicks the door entirely off its hinges, make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our dark little empire. Until next time, stay sharp, know your worth, and never, ever let them see you sweat. Goodbye for now.